And we are live. Thanks everybody for coming back. I'm Dozangs. This is Jaw Jacking. We have Sleepy Steve, who is pulling on the atheist side, and we have again the audience favorite, John, who is back to defend the Christian side of this debate, which we were supposed to have before. Are there good reasons to believe in God? So this is just a continuum of the discussion last week that me and John had. Before we get into it, watch the intro. All right, there we are. Go ahead, Sleepy Steve, if you'd kick us off here.
Sure. Well, I guess my position for the debate is, I'm the non-believer, but I, as I said before, I'm an agnostic atheist, so I don't claim to know whether God exists or not. In fact, I might even venture to say that God's existence is unknowable, but I'm not sure if I would take that position exactly. But I don't believe one exists. And so I guess the debate question is, are there good reasons to believe in God? And I've thought about what my position is towards that, and I guess I would have to say no, because if there were good reasons, I would have accepted them, because I like to think of myself as someone who accepts good reasons to believe in things. So I guess I have never seen reasons that convinced me, so I guess I've not seen any reasons that were good to me. And thus I remain unconvinced. So.
Awesome, man. Well, it's good to meet you, Sleepy Steve. I guess I'll just kind of use my platform here to represent my position. I would say that I actually do believe that the triune God, and when I say that, I mean the God of the Bible, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, God exists. And I would argue that you can logically build your argument based on everything outside of Scripture. I think you could look at science, human history, logical consistency. You hit really like a lot of human experiences, and you could really make a valid argument that there's a lot of reason to believe that God exists. And then through that platform, obviously, I would argue that you'd have to pursue that, right, in order to know if God truly does exist. But the reasons to believe God exists, I think, are pretty much out there. Now, what God, right, that's a whole different conversation. But I think if you look at, for example, I think if you look at human history, right, the overwhelming majority of humanity has believed in a higher power. And so just that would cause you to say there's reason to pursue the idea of a higher power, just in the sense of just history and how humanity and all the civilizations had some sort of awareness. Why do they have that awareness? What's at the core of that? And also say science, right? I would argue that science has a lot of things, the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, these things that, hint towards complexity, which would allow you to think that the idea of a higher intelligent being is not a far-fetched idea based on what is known. So I can go on, but my position would be kind of using, again, human experience, science, logic, history. There's a lot of positions where you could take that path, and we're welcome to do so. And I think it would lead to the idea that there are significant reasons to believe in God. And I would argue even if God didn't exist, there's still reasons to believe in God just from a humanitarian impact perspective. But that's a little bit of a different angle. But that's a little bit of my opening statement.
Okay.
So, Steve,
yeah,
can I ask you a question? Just kind of getting us going. Feel free to ask me a question. So, when you say there's no reasons to believe in God, let me just ask you, what are the things that are maybe presented to you that you would filter and say, that isn't a good reason, right? So what are the things that you would say are reasons others believe, but you would consider them not good reasons? Does that make sense? What are those for you?
I tend to reject moral arguments. I reject, because to me, proving something's existence in reality, that's a synthetic claim, right? We're talking about proving something tangibly exists. It's measurable, testable, observable in our reality. It has influence on our reality. And to do that, you can't rely on analytic claims. So, in other words, you can't logic your way to God. You can't logic God into existence. You can't define words in a way. That's why I reject, I don't know the name of the argument, whatever argument uses the term maximally great, that you're just defining words in a way where you've necessitated God into existence with the words you use. You haven't actually demonstrated the tangible substance of something existing with some kind of physical synthetic evidence. So I think a lot of what you just described would be anecdotal evidence or analytic reasoning that could create conditions where you might think a God is logically necessary, but nothing's actually been proven. Nothing's actually been concretely demonstrated.
Yeah, so let's flush that out a little bit because I'm interested to know your position on that. Do you actually carry that into every area of your life? So do you believe only the things that can be undeniably proven? Or is that only specific to a God? So is that something you carry throughout your whole life when it comes to everything?
It wouldn't be undeniably. I would say like beyond a reasonable doubt is a pretty good standard for things. I mean, the standard of evidence that I would accept kind of depends on the claim. Like, if you walk up to me and say, "Hey, there's a $10 bill in my pocket," well, it doesn't take a whole lot of faith. It doesn't take. I don't really need evidence to go, "Yeah, you probably have a $10 bill in your pocket." In fact, I would just believe it on faith alone. I wouldn't even ask for evidence because it's such a minute claim. But something like talking about the cause of the existence of all of reality, and even beyond that, you're a Christian, so you go beyond just a deistic creator force. You go the extra step to say it's this specific God of this specific doctrine, which I think takes even more of a standard of evidence. So I would, give me the claim first, and then I'll give you a standard of evidence that comports with it.
So I've heard it said, Steve, it must be a book or some sort of atheist talking point, but I hear it a lot. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. I'm hearing that a lot more. It's kind of what you're saying here in the sense of your position is if you're making a claim like God exists, that would be an extraordinary claim. So you need extraordinary evidence. Is that kind of, I'm just trying to articulate your position. Is that fair?
No, that's a good summary. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I would say, again, my question to that statement is, are there things that you believe that are not able to be measured? So I'm just kind of challenging so if that's your position, which again, I acknowledge that I understand that position. Are there, do you actually believe that in a sense of, are there things that you believe in that aren't measured, even extraordinary things? So can you measure the universe and the universe is outside of it? Or are we guesstimated in a lot of ways? Can you measure that within the confines of what we're capable as human beings? Or do you have a degree of faith in certain things that are maybe outside of our capacity to know, but yet logic and reason would point to suggesting that exists? Are you kind of following my thought process? Is there something that you would say that qualifies in that world outside of God?
Kind of, and I don't think so. Even beyond that, I think only things that could be demonstrated to me in some kind of measurable way.
So you wouldn't believe in anything outside of what's measurable?
I mean, measurable is kind of a confining term.
Sure.
But I would say demonstrable. Demonstrable is probably a better word.
Okay. Can you give me an example of something that, again, I'm just again, I understand your position, I really do, but I'm challenging the idea that that's logically consistent with reality, right? Like if the idea is I only believe those things, can you measure, like, do you have a dog or a cat? I'll just give you an example. Do you have any animals? Do you think your animal loves you?
Probably not in the way that we humans would talk about love between partners.
Okay. And how do you measure that?
And that's what I'm saying. Like I didn't want to use the word measure because
right.
you know, I believe love exists, but it's not like you can quantify it. It's more of a qualitative observation, but
sure.
I don't think that means it's any less real, because I think love's demonstrable, and it's also more of an abstract concept, and that would get more into, it's more of an analytical concept that can be supported with analytical reasoning. It's not really a synthetic thing. The synthetic thing would be the physical attraction brought on by the hormones, and that would be the physical substance, is what we call love, is more of a abstract extension of those things, you know.
So you believe in the abstract to some degree?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we describe abstract concept.
Sure. Would you say that if God did exist, in a way he would have some abstract? So for example, if God exists and he created all that there was, is it logically consistent to say that created beings can put that God in a box and measure him?
I don't know if I understand that.
You following my line of reason? So if God exists, if there is a God, right, logically, does it make sense that the things he created could measure him in its entirety? So, for example, if I would say that God is greater than, if I would make a distinction to say if God exists, then he is higher in his intellect, right? Higher in his ability to create, and he is higher than me. I'm a created thing that is less than, right? I always use the comparison. I read it in the book once, ant to the internet, right? When you look at an ant and you look at the internet, you say, okay, there's an acknowledgement that there's a limitation between the ant and the internet. Now, I would argue logically, if God exists, that limitation would exist within his created. So my only point is to say, if God is fully measurable, is he God? Are you kind of following my thought process there?
Right. Well, that's where I would say, I agree. God, as I understand it, as it's been described to me, seems to be an unfalsifiable concept, something that's spaceless, timeless, immaterial, ethereal, beyond comprehension, yet comprehended by all. You know, and in that way, that sounds very abstract. It's very outside the normal. But not in the way, but it's not demonstrable. Whereas love is abstract and demonstrable, love is a descriptor we apply to very real physical things that occur, that we observe, that we experience ourselves. Whereas God is, you're applying the term abstract to him, but it would be such an abstraction that it would be beyond demonstration.
So yes, in theory, the fullness of it, but I would say that it doesn't necessarily mean that revelation didn't occur, right? So I would say as a Judeo-Christian, right, I would argue divine revelation. I'm sorry, man, I might have lost you.
A little hiccup.
You got me?
Yeah. Yep.
I would argue that divine revelation came in the person of Jesus. And so what I mean by that is the idea of understanding God is one where as created beings, we would not have the ability to understand our creator. There's a gap there. So the only logical explanation would be he would have to bridge that gap. He would have to bring something that's tangible that we would be able to measure to prove his existence, right? Or he could exist, we could exist, and to your point, there's no ability for us to be able to know that he exists, right? There'd be nothing measurable. So the logical thing would say either he exists apart from us, right? So this is a position for some world religions where God created the world, and then he's just kind of outside of the world hanging out, and he's indifferent towards it, right? And if that was true, I would agree with you in to say, even if there is a God, there isn't a tangible way to measure if he is existing. I would argue that through the revelation of God to man, right, that I would argue is the inspired word and the person of Jesus, we now can conclude with two things, right? If we believe that, is that God is real because he revealed himself to us. And he revealed not only that he's real, but he revealed his character, his standards for which he created the world, right? His expectations for it. And then he also revealed his love. If he came as a person, right, to atone for the sins of his creation. And so to me, I would say, yes, God himself, I would agree, that he is unattainable and unmeasurable unless he actively pursued us and gave us something that we can say, okay, this is evidence that God exists. And so in that line of thinking, I would argue God says there are two lines of evidence that is not measurable, but is written into the DNA of what he created. One would be the nature around us. And so I would argue that that's a reason why we could say God exists, because there's complexity and order and structure. These things suggest intellect, right? They suggest intellect. Now, it doesn't prove intellect, but they suggest it. So the idea that we are random and that we're all stardust and we just kind of randomly evolved is actually not aligned with what is known. And so what we have to do is, if that's true, we have to add time, we have to add complexity to justify what is known, because obviously there's DNA structure and there's all these things that you can see. And so I would argue creation leans towards an intelligent designer. Again, I'm not even arguing who, I'm just saying logic also, you could argue, okay, we know that these things exist, space, time, matter. I would argue if you logically go down that path, you would have to end with some sort of uncreated being or an uncreated universe, but still both would require an uncreated being. So logically, you still have to get to that place of origin, which is another reason. And then I would argue, and again, this is harder to debate, right? I want to acknowledge it, Steve, but God says he's written his truth on our hearts. So I would argue even our ability to debate each other right now, the ability for us to contemplate our own existence, to debate each other, is proof that we are made to pursue God intellectually, spiritually, emotionally, because we are beings that are debating whether he exists. And I would argue it's because it's written in our heart to do that, because we are created to worship him. For example, you're not going to see a bunch of cows sitting on a computer screen debating God's existence. I believe we are made as image bearers of God. And I would argue even our desire to debate is a reason to suggest that there is a God. So couple, I mean, feel free to push back on all that, man. That's just some of my thought process.
I'm gonna have to push back.
Yeah, go ahead.
That's a lot of presuppositions.
Sure, go ahead. Tell me which one else.
I mean, the certainly you admitted the one. I'm not going to go into the one at the end because you openly admitted you couldn't take a hard stance on that one, so I'm not going to nitpick.
We can argue emotion, right? Can argue emotion.
Yeah, like presupposing intelligent design, I think is I think there's no basis there. I don't think logic leads us to conclude that that because life is quote unquote complex, that therefore there must have been a creator. I think that's kind of just begging the question a little bit. I don't know if that's the right fallacy term, but yeah, I think that's just a presupposition. Under what basis are you concluding that there's an intelligence?
Again, I would argue based on what is known.
It's just
based on what is known.
So around us, it insists upon itself.
So again, I would say based on what is known, it is not unreasonable to suggest intelligence. It's not an unreasonable position. It doesn't mean it's true, but we're talking about reasons. So for example, if we would see complexity as human beings, we would suggest intelligence. This is not an unreasonable position. And that's all. My only point is to say, intellectually, that's not an unreasonable position to make. Now, if it is suggested that it's not an unreasonable position, well, then you'd have to say, how do you reason away complexity? Because the complexity exists. Now, I don't argue, I don't know if perfection exists, but that's a fascinating thing too. Why do we compare everything to some sort of perfection that we don't even necessarily know, but we hold everything to? That's ultimately an interesting conversation too. So if I said the world is complex and you'd say, no, it's not complex, I would argue, so what standard are you using to say that something isn't complex? We actually, to me, I would say that even our framework for filtering the reality in our world is not based on the idea that we just came randomly. It's not. We don't filter the world through that. We don't filter our experiences, our emotions.
I disagree that anything.
Sorry, I can't hear you, Steve. Sorry.
I disagree that anything's random. You've used the term a couple times, randomness, and like stardust. I don't think that there's randomness to the world.
Can you walk me through that then? Can you walk me through that? Just your position on that. I'm curious to know how you can suggest non-random without an origin.
I mean, there is chaotic forces without a doubt, and there is some elements to things that are random. For example, evolution. Ultimately, the mutations that occur within individuals occur randomly. They do. But what takes place after that is nothing less than a natural progression, a natural logical progression based on the factors at play that go on afterwards. So the mutation that made this individual more suited to its environment was random, but that doesn't change the fact they are now as a result better suited to that environment. They thus are able to reproduce more easily.
So then it's
thus
not random, right?
Enter the gene pool and that mutation proliferates. So just because an element of that was random doesn't mean that there aren't forces at play pushing things in certain orders, or at least what we humans.
Can you explain the origins of those forces? Are they intelligent?
I don't believe they're intelligent, and in terms of origin, they're just a description of what is. I don't know.
Is the intelligent, or is it random?
It's like if things were different, then they'd be different. But
so what I mean by that is when you talk about adaptation, right? Microevolution, which is measurable, it actually isn't random. So people that live in colder climates adapt to the cold. They're not random. It's not a random adaptation. It's actually very specific to environment and condition.
Well, humans are unique in that our adaptation over time has been intelligence, which has allowed us to tame the natural environment. So now natural selection is much less of a force upon us than it used to be.
Right. So what required, and I get what you're saying, man. What required, like, how do you intellectually jump to intelligence?
From where?
From random. How do you make that leap?
I disagree that there.
If you just go back with me, though, well, you would acknowledge, though, that we are intelligent, which is right. I'm just like that's. I would agree with you. So we're intelligent, and you're saying that we would evolve to that intelligence, right? I would just say that you then have to significantly explain how we jumped from non-intelligent to intelligent. That's a big leap, man. That's a lot. Logically, that's a large leap to make, because
it's not a large leap. It's a progression. It's an evolutionary progression over millions of years, favoring certain adaptations and an increase in.
I agree, but it's a fine-tuning evolution. So that throws the theory out, because it's not a random; it's a fine-tuning. So you're not going. You're not
fine-tuning. It's nature selecting those traits. Those traits are beneficial to the individual and beneficial to the population, and thus they are able to reproduce, and they naturally produce those.
See, but you see what you did?
Proliferate those genes.
Yeah, but Steve, you see what you just did there? Because you just had to say, which I acknowledge logically, the nature selected. So your default is intelligence. Now you don't want to create, you want origin, but you want selection. You want reason to be part of our creation.
The natural environment around the individual is what selects the beneficiality of the trait.
Right, but is that true? Like, I'm just challenging you to say, is that true? So in that argument, is that what's known?
That's what we.
Or is it a?
That's what I understand the biology consensus to be.
Right. So I'm all I'm trying to do, man. And again, I appreciate you're intelligent. I'm not trying to. What I'm saying to you is, you have, like, if you say, do you believe that the world had? I guess this is probably a better question. Do you believe the world had an origin, in a sense of not maybe an intelligent, but do you believe, for example, in the Big Bang, that there was a force that created all that we know? Or do you intellectually go in a different path?
I'm not going to act like I understand all of Big Bang cosmology. The two things I do know is we have good evidence suggesting that the Big Bang is a pretty accurate model. And number two is when we try to look at the very early seconds of the Big Bang and look at pre-Big Bang, whatever that means, our understanding of quantum physics breaks down. From what I understand, things get vastly complex, and natural laws and the things we understand about physical reality don't tend to exactly apply very well. It's a totally kind of new, it's the newest frontier of physics is the Big Bang. So we can kind of only look at that snapshot, and then ahead of time, looking at pre-Big Bang is, to me, total speculation at this point. We simply do not know.
So is your position, because again, man, like if you're just hearing yourself, it doesn't lend to like the origin. If you don't have the answer to the origin, everything's a presupposition. It all is. So for example, when you say that natural order happened, you're assuming things like uniformity.
It's what
right?
we humans can look at the universe and see order and see chaos in what we describe it to be. But there's, no matter what, there's the natural, what we call the natural laws that we've come to discover, like gravity, the different force, weak magnetic force, strong magnetic force, yada yada, so on and so
right.
forth.
And
we know these things are tying everything together, even though we're seeing exploding supernovas and chaos in space. But then we're seeing that chaos turn to order, where things collect, like a star explodes, chaotic. But then gravity takes over, pulls those particles together. You get the formation of planets, you get the formation of stars, and what the appearance of order seems to come about, and you get solar systems, and now that looks orderly to us, to our monkey brains,
Right, but if you're saying, because again, your statement there, I agree with you in that we're limited. So to say that there is no God and there's evidence to that, but yet not knowing order, acknowledging that from chaos comes order, these things logically, man, are a big leap. They're a big leap. So for example, if you say anything is measurable, then you depend on something. So if I say that only thing I'm going to believe is something that's measurable, I'm indirectly saying that I am dependent on something like uniformity in nature. Like if I'm going to measure something, I assume that every time I drop this box, there's going to be uniformity. That means gravity's. Yeah. Now, you would acknowledge that's not true, because it could all of a sudden change. It could all of a sudden change in the sense of what we understand to be.
There's no good reason to believe they would.
Okay, so then if you look at the universe, can you tell me something that is continually ordered based on the worldview that you're arguing existed? So is something continuing to be...
We're using terms like chaos and order, which are very arbitrary terms. They're not very scientific terms. They're not very specific. They're quite subjective, almost somewhat poetic in the sense that we're using them. And when I say, exploding supernova, chaos, it looks chaotic, but the forces that have actually caused that star to explode are the same forces that are causing that planet to form together in the aftermath.
Okay, so where's the energy come from?
We're just arbitrarily assigning the appearance of chaos, the appearance of randomness, and the appearance of order, and the appearance of,
Right. So you're saying that, and you're saying that appearance isn't reality. I agree with that. But I would say that doesn't answer the question, because you still have to justify what is known. So where does the energy come from? Where does the laws come from that create order out of chaos? Do they just exist? Are they? Because then you would actually have to acknowledge that you believe in intelligent, non-existing things. You just don't believe in an intelligent, non-existing thing that we call God.
I don't believe that gravity is an intelligent force or the product of an intelligent force. I don't know what would cause me to conclude that. The fact that mass attracts other mass is supposed to...
What about the fine-tuning argument? Would you ever consider that? So it's not just gravity, it's how it's positioned. That's very interesting, right? You have to acknowledge that.
It's like if things were different, they would be different, but they're the same. So that,
yeah, but that's not
different. Yeah, things would be different.
Yeah, but that's not an argument
for they are now. They had to be that way.
Yeah, but that's not an argument for any. That's not an answer, right? That's not an answer. So it's like, if things were different, they were different. That's not an answer to what is known, because I could say if things were different, but that's not an answer because they aren't, right? So like, if I would say everything is random all the time, that would actually lean towards the idea of, listen, ultimately, and you mentioned morality, ultimately everything's subjective. So I could measure things, but then I could maybe be wrong, and I could think of this, and so really, even the idea of saying God doesn't exist, that statement is irrelevant if you carry that line of reasoning throughout everything in your life, because you have to suggest, because of what is known. Again, what I'm saying is that you can't look at what is known, and the only reason we're talking about reasons for God, we don't know something that isn't what it is. And what we know of things is there's a lot of complexity, there's a lot of fine-tuning, there's a lot of things that would suggest that even if you believe the Big Bang is the origin,
there's the appearance of fine-tuning. There's what creationists call complexity.
right? But if you justify the mathematical, like if you just go mathematically, it's an impossibility for it to be random. Like it is. It's an impossibility.
It's not
okay,
random.
so if you would go Big Bang Theory, right? And let's say you put a time period to that. Whatever you want to say is when that happened. And then you would have to say, logically, when that started to what is known now as what's observable, right? And you would say, okay, and really 7,000 years, 10,000 years is whatever we have of human recorded history. One could suggest that's when civilization learned to write, whatever. But we only can really measure humanity to that time. And then you have this huge gap between whatever you say started, whatever time, billions of years, whatever you want to say, and now. And in that time frame, if you say that we started, you have to then justify mathematically all of what is known. You have to do that. You have to say these things occurred in this time period, and then you have to justify not only what is known, but the fact that there's all these things that are dependent on each other. So it's not even just one random awesome complexity. It's one random complexity that is needed to build on the other random complexity. And so again, mathematically, the chances of us being what we are today, based on whatever origin you want to put in it, and saying it's random, it just doesn't align up with what is known.
So again, it's not random. And the way you just described everything is like completely backwards. That's like
push back.
Like that's like getting the winning lottery ticket and going like, what are the odds? Well, you know, it's gonna happen. Like, you know, if we set up our own trial universe and assigned it natural laws and sent it on its way, and it eventually arrived at some, you know, other species evolving on some other planet somewhere, you know, that species would go, what are the odds that we could exist? It's a 1 in a bajillion chance, but it's not. It's 100% chance.
So your default, but your default is random. That's why you have to say that. But I'm not arguing that the guy won the
lottery. I said that's random.
No. But see, but when you say it is, what you're saying is whatever happened between now and then happened, and I'm going to just assume that it happened randomly because it is what it is. Because it
didn't happen random. It was a number of ordered processes that we've come to understand and reason out, and we know that logically.
So do we have control?
Even though we don't have observed perfect history of the formation of Earth and the butterfly effect, if you will, from the point of Big Bang to humanity, that doesn't mean we can't discover all the processes by which you can get from here to there.
And I agree in the idea of science is wonderful, right? It's an observation of what is known. I like science. The only thing is that did we have any control over what happened in the past? Did we have control over it?
No.
So then what is it?
It's a collection of evidence that we collect and recreate the best possible picture of.
Yes, but did we have control over it? Did anybody have control over it?
No. Not
so
that
what is it?
I believe.
If there's no control over something, what is it by definition? Again, I'm just trying to justify my position. You can say it is what it is, but it is ultimately random. And if that's the origin, then there's actually there's no meaning for anything. There's nothing. There's nothing on nothing. You could argue we think the way we think because we think it. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Your position's not right. My position's not right. It doesn't matter. It's just random. And I know you're like random isn't existing.
That's not true. That's not. You can't just say. I mean, even if I did agree that the origin of the universe was random, which we don't. It comes back down to the Big Bang, and then I said we simply don't know. So I claim nothing. I claim we don't know.
So we don't know a reason to maybe suggest.
But even if I did, saying the origin of the universe is random, therefore every single thing after that point is random is simply not true.
Is it ultimately though?
Back to the example of evolution, and just because that mutation was random, if you decide that mutation is the point of origin, you know, just because that it was random doesn't mean it can't, you know, doesn't mean things that come after it can't have a logic to them or follow natural laws or have any kind of subjective meaning.
Yeah. So, but then where, if those laws aren't random, where's the absolute in those laws?
I don't know what you mean by absolute.
If there's laws, where does the laws come from? Where's the intelligence to say something is, even if it's natural law?
They weren't handed down. They're a measurement of what is.
Okay.
We measure gravity to be a certain thing, and that's what gravity is.
Does it change?
What do you mean by change? There's gravity on the moon, and
can gravity change?
The force at which gravity pulls me will differ, but the force of gravity itself is what appears to be a constant force that you can find whenever two points of mass exist.
Interesting. So there's a law to gravity.
There is an attraction to 2 points of mass.
Okay. So
anytime you have 2 points of mass, they will attract to each other.
Why?
That's the property we've observed that we call gravity.
But again, I'm just pushing.
I'm sure physicists could get into like a much more detailed explanation of why and like the actual like.
But it's observation. The point is I'm not actually saying you can't observe that which is known. But you can't explain away that which is known with random, or you can't explain that which is known with there is an intelligence. You can't do that. You can say that I don't think that there is an intelligent God that exists. I don't know if you can reason away that not being a viable option based on what is known. And we could change direction in this conversation because obviously, man, like my only thing is to say like intellectually, logically, I don't think you can just say it is what it is. I don't think you can say that if you're intellectually honest, because you don't do that in any other area of your life. And so to do that with the question of origin, I would actually say is actually not necessarily like
going on in my natural life aren't usually questioning the fundamental laws of reality. And what it goes on in my day-to-day life is informed by my understanding of those things, right? My understanding of gravity means I don't go walking off rooftops, you know what I mean? So it's been lumped into my collective assumed knowledge about the world because that's how we've measured the universe to behave.
So is your basis of faith then based on what is measurable by man? Would that be where your level of faith is?
I mean, when we're talking about things' existence in physical reality, yeah, it would be measurable and demonstrable in some way. If it's a synthetic claim about something existing in reality, if I didn't know what gravity was, and you said, hey, there's this thing called gravity, it's when, you know, 2 pieces of mass attract each other, and you're on a big rock, so if you walk off that cliff, you'll drop towards it. I would maybe be incredulous of that fact. But it would take a demonstration of that to change my opinion, you know, and you could probably demonstrate that force with relative ease.
Yes, Steve, would you say that are you confident in, it sounds like you're not necessarily confident right now in the origin of how we got here? Or would you say you're confident?
No, I don't claim to be an expert in physics. So going back to Big Bang cosmology and that stuff is definitely not my strong suit.
No, that's fine. Would you say that physics can hold the answer to origin?
Well, the answer to origin, maybe. I don't know.
So I think that's reasons to consider God, right? I would argue that's the reasons. If we don't actually know origin yet in the scientific community, I think that's a reason to pursue God in a sense of intellectual.
I would be willing to label it like supernatural. Because supernatural by definition is that which is outside the natural.
Fair.
So if that which exists pre-Big Bang does not comport with our any of our known laws of the universe. It breaks all fundamental laws. We have to develop a new sub-level of physics to even explain it. You know, to us, that is now supernatural. That is outside our understanding of the natural. Although if you then were able to describe it and codify and express it with mathematical equations, it would cease to be supernatural. It would just then be a part of the natural, right? So supernatural is kind of perpetually out of our reach. So
can you make that intellectual leap? No, I think you articulated that well, Steve. Can you make that intellectual leap then to say that God doesn't exist? If what you just said is that supernatural is outside of our.
I never claim to hold the position that I know God doesn't exist or that I declare God doesn't exist. It's just I remain unconvinced of a God's existence.
So would you?
I don't believe an appeal to effectively an appeal to incredulity and a God of the gaps argument, which is the origin of the universe, the ultimate we don't know, big question mark. To go, God is a possibility. Okay, well, sure, God is a possibility. I'll always admit that up front. It's but I wouldn't. It's not, it being a possibility is not reason enough for me to believe it.
Well, I would say that's certainly reason. Like you have to build on that. I would agree with you, Stephen, that you have to, like, it's not the only. So origin, right? I would argue that the reason that I am a Christian intellectually is because the biblical worldview answers origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. It answers all the questions to me. And it answers the questions logically. Now, is there a degree of emotion to it? Sure. Is there a personal revelation? Sure. But I would say logically, a God who exists outside of time, space, and matter, that is intellectual, right? And that has the very character that we have in the sense of has love, compassion, it's relational, makes sense to me based on what is known. Now, the idea that Christians dismiss the scientific revelation that we've had in the history, I think is also intellectually weak. To say that science does not reveal what is known as well is very, very ignorant and naive. To suggest that science doesn't have the ability to help us answer the questions of why things are the way they are. I would argue the more we understand of science, the more we find the complexity exists. It doesn't suggest the more we break open things that we are not complex. And so to me, intellectually, I can disconnect the two. I can say science has the ability and humans have the ability to do wonderful things in revealing what is known in the world. But to say that an intelligent being that exists outside of what is known, who's omnipresent, omniscient, that's not logically a leap for me, because I actually would say that origin-wise, that gives me a source of origin that makes sense to what is known. But to your point, man, I just want to argue my position. It's not enough. It's not enough to say, well, there could be a God, but we don't know him. And it's because I have to also deal with the revelation stuff. I have to deal with the fact that in the history of humanity, most of humanity acknowledged this higher power, right? You will never find a civilization that didn't have music and a sense of a higher being. This is just human nature. I don't know why, but that exists. And so then I have to ask the question, if that's human nature, why does that exist? Is it a survival thing? And if God exists, like on my previous argument, if there is a God, then is there revelation to man? What do we have? Okay, we have all these religions. Okay, I have to then intellectually say, if God does exist, I have to pursue these religions to try to weed them out. And if they're not logically consistent, if there's no empirical consistency, like I have to weed those out to see if there's anything that holds water to what is known. Again, origin, meaning, morality, destiny. I would argue that is the reason that I believe that God exists. And I believe that Judeo-Christian worldview answers all four. And that, to me, does not eliminate my need for faith. But I would argue everyone has a degree of faith in something. But reason would suggest that science doesn't answer origin. Or at least, let's acknowledge this, it hasn't answered it yet. And so until there's a viable explanation for what is known, I think there's still reason to consider God. And that would be, again, just to get us back on topic. By the way, man, Steve, I'm really impressed by you. You're super intelligent, sharp. And I was pushing back a little bit just to kind of flush out. And I acknowledge that, maybe my language is I appreciate you challenging my language and how I talk about science and stuff. I would want to admit as well, I'm not a scientist. And so though I love to read, I certainly want to acknowledge there's a gap between what the field is and what I'm trying to articulate here.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you as well. You're very a positive, upbeat person to talk to, and I appreciate the level of respect with you that you engage with.
Thanks, man.
Just as well,
do you have any questions for me? Any challenge, like anything for me about, I kind of attacked your position a little bit on origin. Feel free to attack mine, or if you have any questions about my position.
We could get into more Christian specific things.
Sure.
It doesn't take a lot for me to entertain the possibility of God's existence. Like I said, we simply don't know. The origins of the universe are a question mark. It's a gap in our knowledge. Could a God be in there? Sure, a God could be in there. It doesn't take a lot for me to admit that there's a possibility there. It is another step entirely to determine what that being is, and it's even more of a leap to determine what that being wants from me. It's edicts for human life, and everything like that is just more on top of that.
Sure.
And you mentioned those. You rattle off those few things.
Sorry, man, that was fast. Yeah, origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. That's the framework for an apologetic debate, right? Is how do we get here? Is there purpose for life, right? Is there ultimately meaning, and what happens after we die, right? Origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. So the idea is, like, to your point of morality, right? Is morality objective? Is it subjective? Is it just cultural? These things, I think these positions of what we know, like, we know we're going to die. So, like, are we worm food? Is there something else? How do we know? Purpose, we ultimately all kind of gravitate to purpose. Is there an ultimate purpose greater than ourselves? Do we define our purpose based on our culture? There's so many questions that are in that, right? But to me, logically, we're all asking those questions, I think, and we all have answers to those questions, right? Some of us, yeah.
For me, in my worldview, I take all those things and I kind of separate them entirely from the God question. For me, proving God's existence is a very scientific endeavor. Like, I want physical, concrete proofs that are kind of substantive. And that's why I don't really like moral arguments for God, and appeals to morality, and appeals to meaning and purpose and things like that. Very kind of poetic things, very abstract things. And to me, morality is subjective. To me, purpose is self-created, and meaning is also derived personally. So for me, I can create a worldview absent a God that does contain all of those things that you said, or I have my own answers to those things, I would say.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, man. My computer's about to die, so I'm texting my wife to get my charger. So I wasn't trying to ignore it. So yeah, man, I would say, would you consider that your answers to these questions are based on your worldview? That's kind of framed from. Does that make sense? So your worldview would be that, and again, I don't mean to speak for you. I'm just trying to understand, because we don't really know if there's a God exists. We do have measurable scientific data that we can rest in knowing there are certain truths that science exposes. But because we don't know there's God exists, I would assume that God is not personal God. And so therefore, any definition of things like purpose and meaning would have to arise from my own definition that would work for me and what I'm comfortable with and what makes me happy. Is that fair?
That would be a simple but fair assessment of
Yeah, so again, I go back to my position. And by the way, man, I was an atheist for many years. I'm not an atheist. I know your chat's wondering if I am or not, but I'm not an atheist, but I was. And so to me, again, I go back to this idea of, I understand your position apart from revelation. Like, I do. So if God didn't reveal himself the way I believed he did, that's a logical position to say, if there is a God and he doesn't tell us why the heck he made us, well, then screw him, dude. I'm just going to define my own, and I'm just going to live it up, and I'm going to be as happy as I possibly can. And if there's a God and I die and I find him, and he's exists, and I'm going to say, hey, dude, why is it so hard? Why didn't I know you exist? Why'd you make it so hard? Like that, to me, logically, Steve, like I get that position, again, apart from revelation. What got me was I believe God revealed himself to humanity. I believe God entered into that which he created, and he spoke into this world. And he showed us why the world exists in a way that all of us recognize that it's not perfect and there's something screwed up. I believe he answered that question of why things are not right. I also believe in Jesus. He proved that he was God through his resurrection. I believe that. So again, this goes back to at the core of what I believe. And by the way, it's not my job to make you believe, Steve. I'm just trying to articulate my worldview. At the core of it is not a religion. It isn't. At the core of it is I actually believe that there was a man who literally lived named Jesus, who literally claimed to be God, and he came back to life after he died. And to me, if that's true, and again, this is a whole different conversation of is the resurrection historically true? Is Jesus? If that's true, which I believe it is, then that gives me, that has to make me stop and say, oh, what if he was? What if this guy was God? And then it makes me see the scripture and say, if he was God and he proved it by raising from the dead, then what he said here now matters. Because now I have this bridge between the God that I didn't know if I knew to a God that says, no, I am him, and this is my character, this is my nature, this is my revelation, this is the purpose of your life, this is the meaning of your life, this is what happens after you die. And he answers those questions specifically because he is the God who ultimately created all those things. So in my worldview, I would say that it sounds like, for Christians, it sounds like oh, that's just like a non-intellectual thing. Like they're just going to say God did it. But no. My thing is, at the root of it is if God did reveal himself to man and it was God, then we as created beings have the obligation to pursue that exhaustively, to pursue it in a way of like, dude, every day I wake up, I try to prove this wrong. I try to, because if I live my life worshiping a God that doesn't exist, you know what I mean? Like that's crazy. Because if God doesn't exist, I'm making decisions based on something that isn't real. Well, then I'm just kind of a fool. But if he does exist and he did reveal himself to man, and I don't actually pursue that, well, then I'm a fool as well. Because then if God revealed himself to me and I'm sitting here being like, oh, God doesn't care, God's not real, I can't know him, but I can know him, dude, one, it would be a disservice to me to not pursue the God who created me because I want to know why I was created. So all I'm saying to you, man, is do you get the drive of why at the root of Christianity, it is the actual, to your point, we believe that God is not distant and that God is knowable. And that drives how we see the world. That drives how we see the complexity in the world and say, oh, that makes sense because God is, and so it drives how we see the world. And I would argue in any of these debates, man, like our worldview is ultimately what shapes our thought process, is what shapes what comes out of our mouth, right? So I fully acknowledge that my worldview is built on, there was a God who created the world and he's a personal, intimate God. And I filter things through that. And I don't know, I'm just trying to represent, like that to me is not an intellectually weak position. It really isn't. It could be, hey man, it could be a delusional position. You know, I've been all over the world with the gospel, and I certainly have never seen it in like there's intellectual giants, and you have to acknowledge this too, who are theists.
I think you have I think you fleshed out that you're following a logical progression. You're saying, if A, then I must B. You know, if A, then I must be. If God provided evidence of his existence and reached out to humanity, then it is an obligation on me to search for it, and vice versa.
That's right, Steve. Yeah.
So where my contention is the if God reached out to humanity, that's where I have a contention. That's where I would disagree. I haven't seen something that has convinced me that is evidence of that.
Have you exhausted those paths, Steve? I'm sorry, Mickey.
So I went to church. I was a Christian. I'm fully knowledgeable about the Christian theology and the story, and you know its major underlying tenets. And yet I remain unconvinced because I saw logical inconsistencies and an overall lack of evidence, and you know, problems regarding interactions with other religions and things like that.
Okay. So you would say that you have pursued that to a degree. Have you exhaustively pursued that intellectually? To be honest, have you exhaustively pursued that, independent of what you were raised? You know what I mean? Because you were raised to probably have a framework and believe things.
Yeah,
But
no, I was raised as a Christian, and then I started to question that and fell out of that. And then I didn't immediately go, well, then there is no God. I went, okay, well, I don't believe that religion. Let me find a new religion. That was my default was, well, you have to have some religion, right? So go find a new one, right?
Yeah.
So then I started researching.
Right.
Yeah, so I started looking at different things. Islam didn't hook me at all. I wasn't interested just because of the language barrier. They seem to put a heavy emphasis on the Arabic part of it. Like you have to kind of try to form some understanding of that to really be part of the religion. So I'm like, that's kind of a big barrier. And, I kind of lumped all the Abrahamic religions together with Christianity because I'm like, if I don't believe that, then, I don't believe the basis for all those other religions. So then I started leaning more towards, I was a teenager. I was a hippie teenager. So I was like, oh, what about like Wicca? You know what I mean? Like, oh, that's kind of kooky, worship nature and just try to recycle and whatnot. But then I'm like, I'm just playing, it's just role playing. It eventually I'm like, I'm not really believing this. I'm just putting on an outfit, a belief set outfit to accessorize with, it didn't feel authentic or real. And then ultimately I just concluded, I'm like, well, I don't really believe anything, what do atheists kind of talk about? And then I started watching debates between religious people and non-religious people. And,
what debates have you watched? Who kind of influenced you there?
Oh, back in the day, I mean, Christopher Hitchens, of course. Back in the day, it was so cringy, but it was like, oh, Christian gets hitch slapped and all this stupid stuff. And
I've seen
it's very petty.
Dude, by the way, there's a lot of times where he's owned too. Be fair.
No, absolutely. No, he had some terrible takes. If you get into like his politics, aside from religion, he had some pretty awful takes.
Yeah, but have you ever seen him debate some of dude, there are some Christians that have owned Hitchens. Just to be fair. I actually like both of them. Like I actually like watching those. I have a guilty pleasure. I like watching people get owned. That's fun.
Yeah, it is something cathartic about it, right? But I don't want to make it seem like it was all that. I was also watching the Atheist Experience, which I think is a little lower on the snarky meter. You know what I mean? They're a little more civil.
I know those guys.
And then myself, I started going on blogs and certain other debate forums, and even testing my own arguments against other Christians. And that's really what got me into it was testing things out myself and arguing with people and seeing what they presented me with, and if I was able to adequately respond to it or not. And so then I kind of found my own way that way.
Have you pursued the person of Jesus? Let me acknowledge something, man. That may sound strange. I just wanted to. So, for example, there's religiosity, there's religion, right? And I would argue religion is structured in man-made laws, right? And I would argue a lot of it's hypocrisy. So there's religion, right? And then there's the person of Jesus, right? So like they're different, right? Like we exist now, Jesus existed. If you believe that he was I don't know if historically reasonable people can say he didn't exist. I mean, certainly you can debate, who he was, but I would say like, did you pursue the person of Jesus? Let me just answer the question. You probably know what I'm saying there.
I know what you're saying. And yeah, definitely when I was younger and having those questions, before I was having those questions, I was a devout believer without question. I remember distinctly.
What specifically, man? I'm curious.
It was through late middle school, early high school. I want to say I was probably an 8th grader, and I remember being a 6th grader when I was going to church regular and whatnot. And I remember making fun of a girl for something petty, some stupid kid stuff. Her hair looked weird, and the person didn't overhear or anything. They didn't overhear, or it wasn't like a rumor that spread. It didn't affect them at all. But still, I felt horrible. I felt awful. On the bus ride home, I'm like, what am I doing? I'm just like making fun of this person. I feel so bad.
You got a good heart, man.
I'm gonna go. I feel so bad. And I remember laying awake at night praying, please, I know I messed up. I'm trying to be a better person. I remember being a little kid and just feeling all this tremendous guilt and pressure for this, and truly believing that I had to repent then and there for good. And I felt that sincerely. So I, had a sincere religious belief. And then in, leaving Christianity and asking questions, people said what you said, you have to reach out, you have to open yourself up to this force, to the Holy Spirit, to Jesus Christ. And you have to, let yourself be vulnerable and let that, let the Spirit come in and all that different stuff. And I I prayed, I bowed my head and I prayed and I asked and I just didn't see anything materialize. That I didn't have anything materialize in a way where I was like, now that is definitely a sign, or that's definitely a light bulb moment, so to speak. That just never caught. And then I started researching more, and the arguments against Christianity, against religion, kept mounting up in my mind, and the doubt kept building ever more overwhelming, and to the point where I just didn't believe anymore.
Thanks for sharing, man. Thanks for sharing. Would you say you understand the gospel?
Fairly well. I would claim to be no expert. I haven't read the Bible cover to cover, though I've become familiar with just about the entirety of it, just through engaging with it, through arguing it, through audiobook, through
Yeah, man. Well, I tell you that the story that you shared is not an uncommon one, right? Like growing up in the church and having that moral, you were raised, I'm sure, with some moral framework that was biblical, right? And then struggling to know that you're not achieving that or not living that way. And I think a lot of young people face that dynamic of like, do I live in hypocrisy? Saying that I do these things and I believe these things, but I'm not doing those things and I'm not walking in those things. Or do I kind of separate from that hypocrisy and kind of live based on what I understand to be true?
It was one thing, if I could tell a quick story.
Sure.
One point in my childhood that I am particularly proud of myself about was being consistent in my worldview. And it was, I'm an Eagle Scout in the Boy Scouts. And when I was going through, part of that is part of right before you get your Eagle, you've finished all the requirements and you sit down before the board. And the board is comprised of the head of your tribe, or the head of your troop, the head of your like local council members, and some parents who are really active, and the board of trustees and the fundraiser. Yeah, important people. You sit down in front of important people. And they ask you some questions. It's like an interview to get your Eagle. And one of the questions they asked me was, which part of the Boy Scout law would you remove and why? And what might you replace it with? And the Boy Scout law is trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, obedient, cheerful, thrifty, brave, clean, and reverent. That's the Boy Scout law. A scout is all those things. And it's that last one at the end. A scout was reverent. A scout was reverent towards God. The Boy Scouts of America is a pretty explicitly Christian organization, at least the main organization itself is. Yeah. Certain troops can be more religious than others. Some troops are totally not religious at all. But when that came up, and I thought long and hard about it, and I could have just taken the easy way and just made up something about like, I'd get rid of clean because, I like to roll around in the mud or something cute, whatever. But instead I said, no, I would get rid of reverend. I would get rid of reverend because I think, and at that time I was an atheist, and I was like, I think a scout can be a non-believer and not hold any belief in higher power or religion, and still believe every single other part of that law, every part of the motto. They can still be a positive member of their community. They can still do good works, and all these. I don't see any way in which a non-religious scout is any less of a scout. In fact, a non-religious scout could be the best scout you've ever, could embody the spirit of scouting more than any religious scout could. So I don't see why reverence is on there. And I held to it. And I was expecting some of those parents on that board were pretty religious, and they were members of the religious community. And, you know, they didn't revoke my eagle as a result of that. They awarded it to me. But I stood by what I believed and what I actually believed in that moment. I had an opinion, and I was consistent with it, which I'm glad I was.
Yeah. It's cool, man. Cool story.
Thanks, man. I hope I didn't talk your ear off. Sorry.
No, man, that's cool. I love learn about you. And yeah, so you know, again, man, like I have a different path to God than you, and you know, so for me, like I actually think, again, I hope I was trying to understand your position. Like I get the hypocrisy within the Christian church. I get that, and that definitely is you know, that could turn people off. And I also get that, you know. I believe that, you know, when you pursue the Lord, you know, it's not in your timing. So I get the idea. Like I actually think, sounds like you actually pursued him, right? Like you prayed to him, you sought him. And I guess my challenge to you is this. I actually, and again, man, you don't have to believe this, but I actually, there's truth to the gospel, and it's transformational, and it's personal. And again, man, this is not, you know, I acknowledge that this is an intellectual debate. But I would just encourage you, man, like I don't change hearts. You know, you don't change hearts, right? If you've debated anybody, you're like, dude, most of the time people just have their defaults. And if you just talk in.
I mean, if you're debating with someone, you're largely debating for the audience.
Yeah.
And trying to convince the audience. So.
Yeah. But I just would say to you, man, like I would say, don't like pursue, like don't give up on that path, man. Like pursue it in a way that's independent from your upbringing. I just would challenge you there, because again, man, like I just want you to know that, like, and this is going to sound like I believe that Jesus is real, and he's alive, and he's personal, and I don't like to get into my past, man, but like I get that. Like, let me ask you a question. Is your parents still Christians?
My father is not, and
interesting.
My mother's decreasingly so.
Interesting. Do you say that you're influencing them?
I don't think so.
What's influencing?
I didn't. When my mom found out I wasn't religious anymore, she was disappointed, and she was afraid.
See, this is what I want to just challenge you. Like you're saying religious, and I get it. Like I get the category of there's religious people. And let me just articulate the gospel here for you. Religion is man's attempt to know God. Okay, so religion is filled with inconsistencies. Like it's man's attempt to know God. So who are we as human beings, right? We're ultimately self-centered at a root of us, right? We just are, right? So like at the root of us.
I'm going to push back on that. I don't believe humans are self-centered at the.
Okay, can you give me an example? Let's go there. Can you give me an example of history where that's not true?
Through all of humanity.
Can you give me an example?
Okay. Well, humans, we are social creatures. We need each other to survive.
Yeah, we're survivalists, sure.
Right. Through the dawn of our existence, we've needed to rely on each other. Humans, one human alone is not very threatening out in the wild. We don't have fangs or claws, and we're not very strong or particularly fast. But you get 100 of us together, and we can do some pretty amazing things.
So that's theoretical, though. Can you give me an example of a society that wasn't marked by war and pain and suffering and self-centeredness?
I mean, groups of humans are going to compete with other groups of humans for resources, but it's not because they lack the capacity to cooperate. It's that there arose social forces that eroded what would otherwise be a evolutionary drive to cooperate.
So where's the compassion come in? Why are we compassionate?
Because it's typically more beneficial to demonstrate compassion towards other human beings and to cooperate with other human beings.
In what way is it beneficial? Doesn't it demand more resources?
No, because back in, you can put humans in different contexts, right? If a human today has a lot of social considerations and a lot of conditioning that's pulling them into many different directions, and our morality is in many ways a lot more complicated than it was back in the day. Like, go back to prehistoric times where we're talking about the early hominid species, and through that lens, it's much more simple. These
Maybe it's theoretical.
humans
We don't have any
needed,
observation. Let's be honest.
yeah.
There's no observation.
Why am I going to compete with the other humans in my tribe
Survival.
when the real threat is facing all of us? I can't take down a mammoth alone. I need these people to do it with. So,
In some degree, I agree with your argument of tribalism, but you can't actually say that humanity has been inherently selfless. That's not true. It's not true. And I would say, Steve, if you've ever had a child, you'll know that that's nonsense. We're not born selfless and good. We're born selfish. I have 4 daughters.
Aren't you expressing selflessness for your offspring?
No. We're born selfish. I absolutely think that we develop selflessness. We do, but we're not born that way. We're not. I mean, again, and you'll learn this if you have children. And again, I don't know you. I'm just saying, like, it's not true. We're not born good. We're not. As human beings, we're born selfish. It's in us. Now, mind you, culture, society, parents, these things self-correct. But I have to teach my daughters how to share. I don't have to teach them to say mine. I don't. I actually have to teach those characteristics that you actually say are inherent. I actually have to teach those. What's inherent is selfishness and pride.
At what point did you teach them the concept of private property?
Sorry?
Like, a child can't learn mine unless they're taught mine, unless they're taught the concept of ownership.
No.
Which is something that's taught at a remarkably early age, because you're given things at an early age that are exclusively yours, or that you come to see as exclusively yours.
So again, like taught is something intentional. So, for example, who taught her that? I didn't teach her that.
Teach her that what's hers is hers?
Selfishness. Who taught her that?
Did you? I mean,
why didn't she come out? Why didn't she come out giving?
There are children who have a proclivity for giving. In fact, kids can be remarkably selfless. I thought you would have made the argument for selfishness with an adult, but kids, I've come to find, are more selfless than adults. Kids can be selfish.
You can certainly create in a child the desire for, and again, I would argue we are image bearers, so there is innate desires to love but I would say that we're not born good. I don't know. And again, history is not good. There's no civilization in history that you can look to and say they were inherently good. You could say they're tribal, but there's nothing in, like, for example, the idea of utopia for humanity, it doesn't, there's no evidence of that ever existing, because I would argue we are not good. And again, I argue that for multiple reasons. I know we're not good because I believe that God created us and he said that we are sinful by nature. And so again, this is my worldview drives it, but then I also have observable reality.
Sure, but
I don't see any evidence historically of humanity being good. I see
when we're describing the fundamental natures of humans, we should put them in a context that is closest to a state of nature.
Well, but nature, again, that's nature nurture, right? You're arguing. I would say nature wise, are you saying that nurture is what creates good, or nature creates good? I guess that's my question.
I'm saying there are elements of human nature that drive us towards cooperation and cohabitation with other humans.
Agreed.
Inherently. What we would call good, or, the finer points of morality are certainly up for debate. But
when you say good, though, Steve, are those inherent things that you say that we have, are they good things or bad things, or are they just things?
I'm not sure I understand. Sorry.
So, do you think that humanity has certain things that they gravitate towards? Tribalism, for example, you kind of articulated the idea of survival. Are these good things? Are these bad things? Or are they just indifferent, just things?
I mean, you could say good to what ends.
So is tribalism always good?
No, I don't think tribalism is a good thing, and I think tribalism is tribalism goes against what should be the human propensity towards cooperation
Interesting.
because of the added factor of a resource scarcity, right? So competition over resources is going to break what otherwise could be a cooperative and cohabitive relationship.
But does that align with what we know?
I believe so.
Your
Yeah.
statement?
Where humans have sufficient resources under a particularly democratic kind of setup,
We're going politics. I like
there
it.
tends to be peace and cohabitation. It's when you introduce scarcity, it's when you introduce social factors like factionalism along political, religious,
So
or
risk.
racial lines, or
So
that's
does
when
risk.
things start to break up, and we've now, because it's not like we have this, it's not like I'm saying we have this inherent drive to cohabitate that overwhelms everything else. Clearly it doesn't.
So
Clearly
what's our inherent drive? Do you think we have?
clearly our drive, but it's like humans have a natural ability to recognize human faces, the way our body reacts to seeing humans in distress. We've done psychological tests where any human, you show them another human in distress and their stress levels go up. You know what I mean? So there's things inherent in us that
I agree.
at times can even override the tribalism, where it's like, why did I run out and drag this German soldier behind cover and save him? He's the enemy. Why did I do that?
Good question.
There's this kind of primitive thing in us that's
I won't go primitive.
underneath all this social,
I agree. See, this is where we agree, and I would argue again, it's because God's written His law in the heart. I would agree with you. There's an
I
underlying.
would say that's our natural evolutionary,
Right,
drive.
but like, and again, I understand your position. Sorry, I didn't want to talk over you. So let me push back on the evolutionary argument for a second, okay? Would you say that it was necessary for the strong to dominate the weak, evolutionary wise? Was that a necessary thing?
That's not in. I would disagree that that's an accurate encapsulation of the issue.
You want to redefine? Yeah. Do you want to redefine it?
It's not the strong dominating the weak. It's those which are better suited to an environmental niche will win out.
So when did that stop, or did it?
No, that's still persistent. It's just we humans are strong, or we humans have now altered the natural environment in such a way that it no longer drives our evolutionary selection.
Why?
At least not as strong as it used to.
Why?
Because like I said, if humans who migrated north had their skin pigment lightened, right?
Agreed.
And that's back before we had clothing, before we had houses that we can heat. So now an African American person can go live in Norway and be perfectly comfortable with their big parka and their heated house and everything. That we've now commanded the environment so that it no longer is as much of a driving force in selecting our.
Depends on what you say. It depends on the location. That's not true all the way.
It depends on how much, I guess, you leave yourself exposed to the elements and let those. But then it would need to have a substantial enough impact on the gene pool itself, like a whole population. It's not like one person could go live off in the woods and like have a naturally selected variation.
Have you, and again, I mean, I'm just asking, I'm just trying to get have you ever traveled?
Yeah.
A lot. Have you gone to third world countries?
Yeah.
Okay. Why do they still demonstrate those things without mastering their environment? Things like compassion, mercy. So the idea, I guess I'm just trying to articulate your position. So because we've gotten to a place of comfort, clothing, shelter, we no longer have to survive our environment the way that we have in the past, right? So we've overcome certain things that would allow us not to have the same needs or desires to survive like we used to, right? So our ability to have more grace and patience and like compassion has developed because our need to survive has gotten to a point where it's easier. Am I articulating that?
Yeah.
Correct. So in places,
very small time scale as well.
Okay. So I guess my question is that, and you acknowledge that's not true all around the world. There are still places around the world that have no clean water and struggle to have food and are still in a survival state. I mean, I was just in Liberia for 3 months, man. Like they don't have clean water. They're very tribal, right? They live in, but yet they demonstrate the same character things that we demonstrate in our country. So to me, you don't see the gap in like, you don't see the gap that would make sense to say that we've evolved to be the way we are. Like you see a consistency in morality. Really, honestly, Steve, like there's a consistency in morality throughout human history. Like there is. Like the idea of like what humans ultimately felt were good is pretty consistent. And that's fascinating. Now, mind you, it's not 100% aligned, but there's a lot of consistency there. And I guess in the back of my mind, if I poke at the worldview a little bit that you just articulated, I still struggle with the ultimate of it. So like if I would say, and again, this is an extreme position. I just want to acknowledge this, right? So I'm not trying to back you. This is an extreme position. But if I would say, if somebody stood in front of me and you and said, we need to get rid of all of the all of the people in our society that are deformed or handicapped because they're ultimately a drain on our society. Somebody would propose that, right? There has been humans in history, right, who have said the advancements of a species, you know where I'm going with this, it is the primary. I would argue that both of you and I would disagree, correct? We would disagree with that idea of like eliminating. I think we would have very different reasons for why we want to disagree with that, right? You would probably understand my view of saying, no, we are all image bearers. We're eternal beings made in the image of God. We're all valuable regardless of what we externally give to the world. We are internally valuable. We are spiritual beings. Like this is why I would say racism's evil. No, we're going to take care of people because they are people and they're valuable. This is the reason I would say that. And knowing that you're a good guy, you would articulate their value as well, right?
Yeah, they have bodily autonomy rights. Like
right.
The most fundamental thing that you could ever call a natural right, in my opinion, is bodily autonomy. Like what else is there that is such an inherent right than the right to control your own bodily faculties, right?
Okay, but is that ultimately justifiable in your worldview? Is that a justifiable position in your current worldview? So I just explained how that is a justifiable position in my worldview. Is it ultimately a justifiable, or is it a preference based on your worldview? If you're honest, is it a preference or is it an ultimate? Because like you could go anywhere. Like why is racism wrong? Ultimately, why is it wrong? Or is it just culturally wrong?
I mean, ultimately, it's not like I'm saying this is like an objective screed written into the universe, right?
And would you acknowledge that? And I agree. I mean, I appreciate your honesty there. That's a dangerous position, right? If there's no objective reasons to say something is wrong, that's a dangerous position because then it's based on power, it's based on manipulation, it's based on articulation, meaning that if morality isn't objective, that's a dangerous worldview practically. It's a dangerous world. Not to say that it, like, again, you could argue maybe it's not objective, but that's a dangerous worldview to live out in practicality, right? And there is something in us that knows that that's not right. Like there are people that inherently have value. I would argue it doesn't necessarily benefit humanity, But I'm just, by the way, I'm just talking.
argue-
You can disagree. I'm just talking out loud.
No, you can argue and you can reason out why you have a certain moral belief, and we can argue two different moral beliefs. We can argue their validity, we can argue their usefulness, and we can argue their merit, and then we can ultimately decide to adopt those which are beneficial and seem to have the widest consensus of agreement, and we can reject those that don't. So this idea that the idea that because there is no objective morality, therefore all moralities are on a completely equal playing field is absolutely untrue. We as a society, we reason out morality. We as an international community, we reason out morality. We fight wars over it. We pit our different moral standards against each other all the time. And human history is a never-ending timeline of evolving subjective morality.
But that's not true. Meaning, like, that's not true in application. It's not, like, for example, we haven't gotten better in some areas. We've gotten worse.
Yeah. In what areas have we regressed?
Would you say that we've gotten better in our view of life, or worse?
Better.
In what way?
I think we have, I mean, I guess that's kind of vague.
Yeah, I'd acknowledge that is. Do we value life more now than we did 50 years ago?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
I think the way that labor has been treated throughout history is they've been treated with far less value than they are today.
Are we more sexually abusive now than we were 50 years ago?
Sexually abusive. Again,
do we devalue humanity more or less now?
I think there's more sexual freedom.
Really, dude? You can honestly say that intellectually? So if you look at human trafficking, is it better or worse?
It's probably worse, just simply due to
substantially worse. Yes,
the sheer the ability to transport cargo.
The elevation of physical in our world has dramatically impacted women and children. There's no that's, again, man, I've been all over the world. This is statistically true. The gap between wealthy and poverty is increasingly happening. Again, now I'm actually I'm a conservative, but there's a gap in, like, there are things in our society. For example, technology is a wonderful gift, but it's also brought out, I would argue, depravity in a lot of ways. There's a lot of things that are wonderful gifts, but again, ultimately, the idea that humanity has increasingly gotten better is not true. It's not true in the sense of, like, how we treat each other, how we see each other. Ultimately, like, for example, I think you can say laws have gotten. You could argue laws and government, and, like, for example, we don't have kings often, right, anymore. I would argue there are philosophical advancements in the sense of, to your point, how human beings interact and the best way that we interact with each other. But from an objective morality or a subjective morality standpoint, like, are people more in that sense of, like, are we heading towards utopia as a civilization? I would say no, we're not. We're heading towards different forms of destruction. Like, we're not, like, self-correcting things. If anything, this past year is kind of exposed to say there's more division in certain areas of the country than ever before. Certain areas of the world, there's more division. So I guess what I'm saying to you, man, is I always say this to people who argue that humanity is the hope. Here's where I intellectually can't get there with you. Is humanity can't be the problem and also the solution. I don't believe that that's logically consistent. You can't look at humanity and say, here's the problem with humanity. If we just fix this, then everything will be solved. I don't think you can do that logically. You have to say we embrace the fact that we are inconsistent in the way that our cultures and everything. And really, this whole idea of utopia is a false thing. It's just, we just have to, whoever's in power, whoever has the loudest voice is going to control, ultimately, the root of morality, and we just have to accept that. Or we have to stop and say, like, humanity is the problem, and again, this is where I would represent my biblical worldview. So we need a savior, because we're the problem. We're not the solution. We're the problem.
What do you mean by we are the problem?
Humanity.
What problem?
I'm sorry.
What problem?
What problem? So I would say the problem is we are the problem in the sense of we cannot solve our problems when it comes to how we live, how we treat each other, our selfish desires. Again, you can say we can, but there's no examples of doing that.
We can and have.
Okay, how do we solve the problem of murder?
Solve all murder?
It's murder. No. Did we solve the problem? Yeah, sure. Objectively, can we solve murder? Can we solve racism? Can we get rid of racism?
I don't think so.
I don't either. Can we get rid of
the idea that we can't make improvements upon these things? I mean, the crime.
Oh, no. Yeah, I would agree.
The violent crime rate has steadily dropped.
Yes, but improvement is not my argument. My argument is solution. So again, humanities, I would argue.
You're talking about an impossible thing to solve. In what way does
apart from ourselves? Yes, I would say, like, apart from a savior, we are stuck.
But I think
you may say that's the reality. I would say
solving all murder seems to me like an unreasonable.
But why? If it's just cultural, if it's only cultural and environment that causes a murderer to murder, why can't we solve that?
I mean, we could address those things the best we can. It's just the idea of being able to monitor all 8 billion people on the planet.
But if it's just culturally, can't you just shape culture? Isn't that a tangible thing?
And you can definitely see like improvements over time, but like ultimately it's like when people do murder, they're not like appealing to like society. Like
correct.
There's there's mental health considerations, there's like personal factors that, I mean, when they're doing it, they often are doing it against all social conditioning, and most murderers know that what they just did was wrong.
But isn't that
what they just did was incorrect?
But isn't that also
there's been a set of conditions that has pushed them to do so?
Right, but if you can't stop murderers, I think you're acknowledging free will indirectly, and I also think you can't ultimately say that murder is wrong. It's just culturally wrong.
I mean, is murder objectively wrong? No, I don't think there's objective morality.
Right. So then morality is based on, would you say, power?
No, I think morality is, I mean, murder is one of those things that's almost universally accepted because it's so universally applicable. Like every society on earth, there is no conditions which randomly killing an innocent person who's done no wrongdoing.
But is it innocent subjective?
That's never conducive to a successful functioning society.
But isn't innocence subjective? Isn't functioning society subjective? What's a functioning society?
Sure, but
what are we measuring?
If there's a subjective thing that everyone universally agrees upon, or just about everyone universally agrees upon, and all societies have written it and codified it into law because it's so universal, then it basically is effectively an objective moral standard.
But can we separate that though? So if the majority of the world says that we need to kill all Jews, can we separate that? Can we say, yeah, but it's still wrong? Does majority make objective morality?
I mean, we fought a war of it. We went that's wrong. We're going to go stop you.
Right. What I'm saying though is I mean, you could put anything there, right? The majority of the world says killing homosexuals is wrong. Does that make that objectively moral? I mean, if the majority of the world would say killing homosexuals is morally right because they can't produce offspring, is that objectively
it
morally right?
Objective. It wouldn't make it objective. Like I said, there's nothing objective, but it would be so universal that it might as well be. You know what I mean? Like it effectively is. If you reach such a high consensus and everyone comports with it, then it basically becomes enforced as if it was but ultimately it's not.
I get what you're saying. Yeah. So, but I would say again, to the debate topic of reasons for God, we self-correct things even if majority of people believe something because there is objective morality. Like I would argue the reason that slavery in America ceased was because it was wrong. It wasn't that it wasn't prosperous. It wasn't that it wasn't at a time, right, in certain parts of our country, you know, majority-wise justified. It was because it was wrong. And because objective morality existed, we self-corrected. I would argue that, like, I don't think you would see such clean morality in a culture that just became what it was. I think it would be a lot. For example, I think a lot of cultures would have a lot more inconsistency. It wouldn't, to your point about murder, it wouldn't align the way it does. I think, again, that's a reason to say that there seems to be some sense of uniformity within morality. Now, mind you, I acknowledge your argument of how that happened, right? But I would say, like, these things to me, you know, tribal, for example, tribes didn't necessarily talk to each other, right? Like, you can argue that we weren't all in the same location. So the idea that culture drives morality, you would think that we would have a lot of contrasting morality if that was the only thing that drove it. I would say that you could argue that there is a greater factor that drives morality than just culture, and that greater factor, it sounds to me like, could be some, I don't know if I don't want to represent your position, but instinctual things that have been developed in us. Just from a survival, or, you know, that to me is where I think, again, you can't just say culture. I think we both agree, by the way, on that. Like, you can't say culture is the primary driver of morality. There's a greater substance in that.
Particularly with killing other humans, there's this instinctual aversion to it, or at least in neurotypical people, there's an innate aversion.
Yeah, but it's interesting too, because, like, but only sometimes, right? Because in history, if a human being, and again, we're getting off the topic, but I think this is fascinating just in general, right? Like, we don't have to make it all the big questions. Like, the human being has ability to then self-sacrifice if it's in defense of something greater than themselves, right? Like, we know that in history. So you can get a person who would not murder to kill, right? I wouldn't say it's murder, to defend or kill in representing of his king, right? Or protection of his family. There is something in us that actually can separate things, right? And justify sometimes and not. It's a fascinating truth, right? Like, what would compel a human being to willingly sacrifice themselves for something that is an intangible thing? I think that's fascinating, right? Like, that's a fascinating reality. Why would a soldier die to defend freedom? Like, what, you know, freedom to people that he probably would never meet. There's something greater than themselves that they ultimately drive to. And for us, again, independent of God, isn't it fascinating that human beings can see something even in the known world, and that thing can inspire them to almost go against their human instinct? I just think that's fascinating. I don't know if you know what I'm going there, Steve. But
definitely. Like, there's this natural instinctual drive to survive, and this drive to protect, to not harm, at least to not have a desire to harm other humans.
Yeah,
but then
you see that in animals sometimes too, right? Like, when a mother would jump in front of, like, somebody that's attacking her child, right? So regularly that mother would run, but there's a defense in us to protect the innocent, which I think is a fascinating thing, right? Like, and again, like, one of the things I'm always interested in is, like, I would argue the atheistic worldview, it's really hard to live that out. You know what I mean? Like, it's a hard worldview to live out. Independent of whether it's right or not, it's a hard worldview to live out, because you have to ultimately, like, I don't know, man. It's like when I hear people, and again, I know that there's a diversity in thought right here. Like, I acknowledge that. But when I hear, like, love is just a chemical reaction in the brain, like, I struggle, man. I struggle with that, because I just think that's it's intellectually just too lazy. It's just a lazy thing.
It's reductive, but it's because, like I said, there is a physical, chemical component, but
There's
then
there's
this abstraction that we've come to describe, the euphoric feeling, the rush of hormones, and how our minds perceive these things, and also social conditioning of what love is, love stories in our culture that shape our view of what love is supposed to be, what love is supposed. How do you know love when it happens to you? How do you recognize it? Yeah. You think of Pepe Le Pew floating with his tail.
Yeah.
So there's things that come to mind that are more than just a chemical reaction.
Yes. Yeah, there's. Yeah, and I just like to wrestle with that stuff because it's just, again, I guess my biggest thing when it comes to that position is it's just not that clean, right? Like nothing in life is like that. Nothing in life is just like a straight line, right? Like for me, and again, I hope I articulated my faith well enough to you. Again, my job isn't to make you believe, it's just articulate. To me, like even in my faith, which by the way, I'm a pastor. I'm kind of full disclosure, like. My world is shaped around my faith, right? And it's transformed me. I mean, I was addicted, and I could go into my testimony. But the idea, though, is like it doesn't mean that it's all clean, right? Like it doesn't mean that everything I see in life, I'm like, well, I have an answer to that question, right? Like there are 1,000 questions in life that maybe you never even know the answer yet. You know, I would argue, I think it will be revealed, hopefully. But I would say, and I think when people make statements, right, like, I know 100% that God exists, or I know that 100% that God doesn't exist. I'm like, you're just not being intellectually honest, because there's so many things that if you exhaust that, it's just not as clean as we want it to be. Like it's just not. There's gaps, and I would argue again when people say, "Well, God, you're filling God in the gaps." Dude, there's a lot of gaps in general. Like there's a lot of gaps that like you got to wrestle with because they're just not. It's not a clean like. To your point of how I defend it, like A, B, C, a lot of times it's not always like that, right? Like sometimes it's like A, but maybe A and C. And I was telling them, I'm trying to talk to because I don't know where our moderator is. I was telling them, like in my life, Steve, like here's like as I've grown up, it used like there's conviction, right? Things that you're like, dude, I know that I know that I know, right? And then there's opinion, which is like, I think I'm right. You know, I've read some books and I've like talked to people and I think, and then there's persuasion. Like, you know, I kind of think that the Eagles will win or, I like the 49ers, but like, who knows? I don't know. I feel like when you're younger, everything's conviction, right? It's like, even politics, right? It's like, everything's just like, no, you're horrible. And nothing is like everything's just conviction, everything. And I feel like that person's obnoxious and like hard to get off. But I feel like the older I get, the less convictions I have, and the more I'm in this kind of opinion persuasion world, right? Where it's like I feel like this is right, and I think even in our debate, I think we represented sometimes where we were like in that conviction world, but even in that like opinion persuasion thing, man. Like my goal with these is to maybe give you a couple thought narratives to kind of flush out in your mind and in your and I know you've done that to me, and just I think that's useful as humans, right? To like live in that opinion. You get what I'm saying with that? Like almost, I would argue we need more of that in our world. It's like, let's kind of be not arrogant enough to just like go real hard on, because what I learned in my life, dude, is like, if I look back 10 years ago and I see my younger self and how much I thought I knew and how dumb I was, you know what I mean? Like there's a humility to that. Because then you're like, okay, in 10 years from now, everything I think I know, I'm going to see is, like is a humility be like, dude, my 10-year-old self is such an idiot. So I kind of hold that posture of like, you kind of have to humble yourself and saying like, and that's kind of what I'm challenging you with my faith is like, there's stuff that's still yet to be discovered, and there's rabbit trails that still go down, and there's conversations and people to talk to and life to live. And I think that's the beauty of humanity. Like just in general, like we have this life, right? And to grow and to be exposed I'm kind of preaching on you, but I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but anyway, that's kind of, I always try to end debates with like that sentiment of like, that's the better life to live, I think, is if you're in opinion persuasion more than a conviction world. But,
yeah, no, I definitely appreciate the conversation, and I'm not going to say this was the best debate performance of my life. There were things that came to mind when you said certain things, and I knew that there were responses to them that I had heard before, but that couldn't immediately come to mind.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to keep it like I wasn't trying to like I said, it wasn't about getting you on every single point. I was just trying to have a polite conversation and just also get my feet wet with, being on camera and having polite conversations. So I want to thank you for letting me practice with you tonight.
Yeah, and hey, man, if I had like a beer or a coffee with you, I don't know your age, but I would enjoy it, man. You're a great guy. I really get along with you well. And I tell you, man, like in my life, It sounds like you're the same type of guy. I'm not like a how's the weather guy. I like these conversations way better. You know, like I'm not like a
political dude. Yeah.
Yeah. By the way, I got I do a lot of stuff with politics. I'm pretty, now mind you, that's like frustrating, right? Like that whole world is,
I'm
you
sure
know, that just kind of
that's why I wanted to get back into religious discussions, because we're all sick of politics these days, right?
Yeah. So yeah, that world is exhausting, man. Talk about conviction in that world. It's like people want to say, I want to define you completely, right? Like, and that's just such a weird thing. Like, tell me something, and then I'm going to know everything about you. And you're like, that's just such a weird thing to live, right? Like if somebody says they're an atheist, it's like now you know everything about them. You know what I mean? Like it's just a weird, but people do that, don't they? They like box people in. Like, what's your opinion on Roe versus Wade? And whatever you say there is like everything about you.
It's easy, right? Like if you're X, then I know everything you're gonna say. I know every response to every argument you're gonna make. And it's all choreographed out. It's perfect, ready to go. But it's like, then you talk to that person and, oh, well, they don't fit in that box and they don't fit in that box. And I thought they were going to make this argument, but they didn't. And it's like, oh, turns out things are a little more complicated, isn't it?
And then you do get eventually like you've ever had in debate, like the person you debate is exactly what you thought they'd be. I got
and then it happens the other way too, right? Where sometimes you go, oh, you're this. Oh, you probably believe X. And then they just fall right in line with it.
And I tell you, man, like avoid being that person. And you know how that person exists is everything they read, they just believe. You know what I mean? They're just basically like robots. They'll read a book and then that book is what they believe. So they don't actually believe anything. Like they haven't learned to critically think, right? And I would argue our schools don't teach us that.
People who turn labels, whether they be political labels or social labels, into accessories, where it's like, it's not enough to just be left. I'm going to be like, I'm not just left wing and that's just a way to describe my politics. I'm left wing. I dress it. I live it. That's all I read. That's all I talk about. That's how my bio on every social media says that, because that's the most important factor about me. And it's just like, I don't know how people I don't know why you'd want to be a living label.
And it's boring. I guess boring.
It's really boring. And yeah.
I have very little patience with that. Like even in my relationships with people, it's like if you're not able to even like, because I always say this too, man. Like I think I can learn from somebody who I add. Like if I disagree with somebody, I still can learn from them. You know what I mean? Like there's nobody in life that you can't learn something from. So the idea of like predefining everything they're going to say and already having you're going to become like a weird, I always say like that's why the academia, like with professors and stuff, that's where they're like the weirdest people in the world, because it's like an echo chamber. They just kind of like reinforce everything they believe over and over and over and over again. By the way, Christian atheists, you gotta admit this, we do the same thing. It's like we go around people that like agree with us and we're like, yeah, and we just kind of, and even our social media, right? It's like when you like something, then everything is about that thing. And that's actually sucky, because now you're not even going to get any other information except for, whatever you liked. So then you're like, it's just a weird world. But that's kind of
I think social media is also what's causing people to become living labels. Like I said, it's because once people start getting one kind of content, they really like that content and they keep curating it more and more and more until they're just inundated with one thing all the time, whether it be religion or politics or sports or whatever it may be, and it creates one-dimensional people.
Well, I think in light of that, man, before we head off, let's do this to kind of honor our convictions in that regard. Like, give me one thing that you want me to watch or read that you just think will allow me to be challenged, and I'd love to give you one or two things, and we'll just call it a day, and that way we can kind of bring some. Is there anything that you're like, yeah, dude, you should really watch this or listen to this?
I think if you ever saw, I'm just going to go with a classic. If you ever saw the debate between Bill Nye and Ken Ham.
I have.
That's an enjoyable
I think there's
one.
two, right? There's two of them, right?
I'm not sure if there's two or not. I
know there's one. Isn't there one where like Ken Ham walks Bill Nye through his like creation museum? Did you see that?
Oh yeah. That's a different one.
That's like a different one. They had like 3 or so. I didn't see them all. I think I saw the first one, so I'll have to watch the other 2.
Yeah, no, those are good. Like I said, I was really into debating this stuff when I was like in early high school, and then I've largely forgotten a lot of that. I moved on from this entire debate question because it got kind of done to death a little bit. I had argued it so much and got exhausted, and then I got really into politics and moved on with my career. But now it's kind of nostalgic to return to and to debate the religion question again. So.
Well, I actually think that drives a lot, like not the religion conversation, but the worldview conversation. We kind of tagged on a bunch of things. I think the worldview conversation is the most important conversation to have. I actually would argue that because it drives everything else. Like when you talk about somebody politically, like it's shaped by what you think it does. And I would argue, man, that regardless of God, right? Like I'll separate it. I think we live in a world of self-worshipers. I think a lot of us worship ourselves, and it comes out in our politics. It does. Now, mind you, I think you cannot believe in God and not worship self. Don't get me wrong, right? I think a lot of people worship themselves, and so they don't actually care. It's a virtue signal, right? Like they don't care. They just want to look like they care. And I think we see that symptom in our culture. I think people often don't show compassion, but they want people to think they're compassionate, right? They don't show mercy, but they really want people to think they we live in a very like, it's a narcissism, right? Like
The
clinically.
one thing that gets me is I don't know if you're on TikTok at all, but I don't have a TikTok personally, but I see
My
the
wife
ones-
does. I don't do a lot of that.
I see the ones where it's a video and it starts off and it's like a woman going to the side of the road and she finds like a puppy on the side of the road and she's, oh my God, this puppy was abandoned and I rescued it. And I'm like,
Gosh.
and you just so happen to have the camera
Yeah,
ready
right.
with HD in perfect, frame. And it's
That
like,
puppy just got a haircut. Looks like that puppy has a haircut.
yeah, it looks like a well-groomed like puppy straight from
Gonna
Petco or
go on
something.
its hair.
And like the cynic in me, I'm also cynical. Like you didn't rescue that. You staged that for internet points.
And but like, what human being does that? Like they wake up and like, you know what I want to do today? I want to make people think I love puppies. Like who thinks that
not
way?
really do anything to love puppies.
It's so absurd to me. I always look back
Right.
at those people and I'm like, and again, it clinically, right? It's just narcissism. It's like an extreme version of narcissism.
And
Where
I think Bo Burnham said something very prescient. I don't know if are you familiar with Bo Burnham?
yeah. Mhm.
Yeah. I think he said something very prescient in one of his stand-ups. He said social media has created a generation of performers. People demanded the ability to perform all the time, everything they're doing all the time. And so the market supplied that demand with social media.
Yeah.
And now everyone's a performer. Everyone's their own actor in their own life play. And everything from what you had for lunch to what you're doing this weekend is a performance, right? And some people are more entertaining to watch than others,
Yeah.
but we're all performing.
But again, doesn't that also reveal a little bit of our human nature? Because, like, let's be honest, like in the TikTok world, it's like if you have big boobs, you'll be successful. You don't actually have to have any substance. And isn't that that's very revealing of like who we are as people? Like those mediums kind of reveal the true nature of people. And I just think it's fascinating, right? Because like even in this medium, man, like if you and I weren't face to face, like if we were debating on like an atheist page, right, or whatever, we would have to dehumanize. Like we weren't like right now we see each other and like we know that we're humans and that, you know what I mean? And it does something, right? It brings you're not as defensive. But like in that world, like social media and stuff, people don't have that accountability. Like if I would go up to a girl when I was a teenager and like say some of the stuff that guys say online, I'd get slapped in the face. But if I'm behind a computer screen, I can be Mr. Confident, right? Like it's a weird. And to your point about like it perpetuates the worst kind of version of ourselves too, because everyone thinks that they have something to say when most people don't have anything to say and no one cares. Like
we don't like to accept as humans that our opinion most of the time is totally useless.
Yes. But we think it's like the opinion. Like how dare you not care what I say? I'm awesome. Don't you know I'm awesome?
I think this really hard. And it's like, that's great.
Yeah. 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 Anyway, man, we got off topic, but that's fascinating. That was good. That was good. Hey, welcome back, man. We were trying to delay here, trying to get you back.
Oh yeah, no, you're all right. I was just talking with the other guy. We're still waiting on the other guy to come in, so I just wanted to get him comfortable and situated before I jumped back in here. But
hey, we had a great conversation, man.
I was watching. Your guys' face was lit up. Both of your guys' face. I knew it was going pretty good.
Yeah, man, he's a great guy. I appreciated the time.
Awesome. Yeah. Are you guys want to continue? You can if you like. I mean, it's no problem. Or if you like.
I think we had a good conversation.
Yeah. Okay.
Good. Yeah, I think we're hitting like 2 hours, so we're good.
Okay. All right. Do you want to go over some comments or we got some here? All right. We got some here. Let's see here. So, Brad, if you look at the evidence and simply if you wish to see it or not. So basically, keep an open mind type deal.
Yeah, man. Good.
Let's see here. This guy, there's plenty of reasons to believe in God, but not for me, sadly. So I think that's kind of a personal perspective, maybe just from personal experiences.
I have to challenge that statement a little bit though, because
go ahead.
If there's reasons, then why would they not be for you if there are reasons? I guess that's I don't follow that thought process. I agree there's reasons for God, but if there's reasons, right, logically you would say they would have to apply to you, right? Anyway, do you get what I'm saying, Steve?
Yeah. That's what I was saying earlier. Like if you acknowledge that there's reasons and they're good reasons, then why would you not accept them?
Right.
Yeah, it's a little bit. Maybe you could say there's not good enough reasons.
Maybe he doesn't think they're very good reasons.
Yeah. But thanks for watching, dude. That's awesome that you're engaging. That's cool.
Yeah, this guy, you addressed this before. Based on facial expressions alone, I'm guessing John's the atheist.
Dude. I don't know how you can be that wrong, but
What does that mean?
do I have an atheist face? Is there like an atheist face?
There must be, yeah.
I didn't know what is it because I'm like scruffy? Is that like an atheist default?
Maybe, yeah. You look like a hipster.
Like smiling.
I think if I had a WWJD bracelet on and had some sort of like God is my home,
wooden cross,
then it would be like.
That's the Christian, right?
Yeah.
Right. He's wearing all the billboards for
I'll do that next time.
Same guy. Our measurement of gravity and what it is how we understand may be very provisional.
Provisional.
Same guy again. Albert Einstein was perhaps one of the greatest scientists who ever lived, and yet he was a theist.
Yeah, I mean, I always say too, like scientifically, you can't say that science alone, there wasn't theists in those fields, right? Most of the fields had profound impact.
He was Einstein specifically was a deist, and when he talked about it, he said he describes Spinoza's God, which is essentially a deist God, like a set things into motion but doesn't personally intervene. And he was a believer in an impersonal God, if any.
Well, I guess you don't really know, right? Like we have documentation, but
we just have writings of
you don't know the heart. I would argue
we just have writings, that don't mean nothing no more.
Yeah.
Well, what I mean by that, dude, is like for example, I have the privilege, and I mean that I go to hospitals a lot, and when people are dying, and they're calling me in to just be with them in the last moments, and I could promise you, man, like it's arrogant to say that you know what people believe in their very last moments, both ways. Do you know what I mean? Like.
No, you can never know what someone truly believes.
Death humbles. And so I never try to say, that's just a rule for me. I never try to say this is to their dying breath. This was their, because that's too arrogant for me.
They say, too, that Darwin too was a theist, and he not created, but the author, I guess, of evolution.
Right. And again, we try to, and I was talking to Steve, like we try to box people in, like the whole idea that you have to not believe in evolution and believe like that's a, that's a false narrative too. So part of it is like, again, I think, there's this saying, there's not a lot of atheists in foxholes. Like there's a lot of conditions and circumstances in life that change and certain conditions. And again, I think in my experience, death is a humbling thing both ways. Like it's a humbling thing. And so, yeah, I don't know. I would just say from a scientific perspective, theists and atheists alike have advanced science in profound ways, both, right? Both worldviews have driven science, and I would argue theists have driven a lot of science, especially when it comes to the fields. And so, again, you can't say that theists and atheists have to approach science like in a mutually exclusive way. I don't think that's intellectually honest. I don't know if that's what he's asking, but
anyone can use the yeah.
I mean, astrology is astrology, right? Like you see what you see, right? And it's very, like, you filter whatever is seen, it doesn't really affect, because like we were saying, Steve, like there's a philosophical conversation that applies to a lot of this, but that's also separate from scientific method and observation.
This guy says, let your God speak for itself. How hard is that?
Yeah.
I won't even try to pronounce the name. I'll butcher it.
Man, I always had that name. Imagine being like a 5-year-old having to spell that in like kindergarten.
Well, I was gonna say, do you think that's really him there? That
No, probably not. I like the bow tie in this picture though. Well, and I would argue that
Mr. Bentley. That's
true. That's kind of a true statement, but we are called as believers to share the truth. So that's why I do this.
I like having you do it too. You're people like having you on, man.
Thanks,
people really like having you on, really.
Steve, let me just tell you something that's really funny. Yeah. I know I'm live, but I told Dozangs this before, but when I used to do YouTube videos a lot.
Oh, we're still live. We're still live. Yeah, we're still live.
No, I'll say this.
Okay.
YouTube videos a lot, and I won't say my usernames and stuff because I don't even know. They may still exist, but I deleted most of them. And like it, and me and my brother did it. And I actually would argue you probably know my brother. But anyway, so it got really successful, like really, really successful, to the point where we would go to like the beach and go to the bathrooms, and like people would recognize us in like the urinals. And they didn't like us, right? Like we were Christians, so they like did, and so it got to the point where like threatening our family, and like it got crazy. So then I just bailed because I'm like, this is nuts. People are crazy. And so that, to me, like, that's why I'm a little bit cautious with like, because you know how you guys are like, I'm starting these social medias. Like, if it goes well, it actually sucks just as much as it's awesome. Because if it goes well, and then you get all the crazies, and it's hard to like filter that. Where sometimes like you want to control it, but it get to the point where it gets uncontrollable, and that's the danger of social media. Is like, you don't know what crazies are watching, right? Like you don't have any idea.
Yeah.
So you just have to be careful. Even though it's a cool thing, right? It's just I've seen the worst side of it, and so now I'm very hesitant to like.
Right.
Yeah, and so that's kind of where when it talks about like. Yeah, anyway.
I have people that want to do this, but they're scared, kind of for the the reasons that we talked about. And I tell them, you better if you want to do it, you better get in on it early, because if this thing happens, I'm gonna have a lot more trolls. I don't have any right now. I have none. So, if you want to do it, now's the time. Because
I would say too, man, like for you do a great job of moderating the expectation of the debate and stuff, which is great. It's great.
Even though I wasn't here.
Yeah.
Over half of it.
Hey man, your promo is something crazy, man. I was like watching that thing, and that was awesome. It was like snakes coming out of eyeballs, and
I was trying
an adventure.
I was working with what I had. I was trying to follow the story of like, how science people believe, like, DNA and molecules. And we kind of grew up into this, and it started with the Big Bang Theory. So when the two astronauts collided or whatever, it went into that Nubia galaxy. And then you seen the hand of God. Yeah. And then it started trying to go to the Christian way. So I tried to make it.
Oh, I got it. Like, yeah, that was cool.
It was a little longer than I thought.
No, but I totally saw, just to give you credit, man, I totally saw what you were doing there.
Yeah,
it was an adventure, man.
It was an adventure. It was a very good short movie clip. Netflix will be calling me pretty soon.
Yeah. Did you cut that up? Did you cut all that up? Did you dub all that?
Yeah. I created that, I guess you can say. Yeah.
You guys film buffs? Do you like film?
Do I use Filmbox?
Are you film buffs? I'm sorry. Like, do you love film?
Oh yeah. So I really like 80s nostalgia movies, man.
Yeah.
The 80s cartoons, the 80s Rambo and Terminator, and I love Beverly Hills and Coming to America and music, rock and roll, dude. I mean, I'm really a fan of the 80s. Yeah, I love it.
That's awesome. Cool. I don't get that sense with this. You got to put some 80s into this YouTube channel.
Yeah, okay, I'll try that. Yeah,
do some 80s.
The thing is that so you have to be careful because you can get copyrighted like that. I mean, they could take it down and just showing a snippet of the Transformers cartoon or He-Man or Thundercats or just a snippet.
Well, I have 4 daughters. Like I told you guys, I have 4 daughters, all under 10. I know it's crazy, right? I have 4 daughters. Crazy. And I grew up with all these brothers, so I'm like out of my league. But obviously, with like 4 daughters, like princess stuff is all rage. Dude, if you put a Disney thing out on the web, that stuff is flagged instantly.
I'll be right back.
They're just hawks with that stuff. So I'm always impressed with the Disney. Whenever the copyright thing's happening with Disney, it's like lockstep, man. Okay, I think he bailed, but
Mouse is always watching.
All right, man. We got off topic.
No, I'm still here.
Yeah.
Well,
Disney, like you can't do anything with Disney, man. They're so like. I think we did this one thing with my daughter for like her birthday, and we tried to do like a Disney song for her like birthday YouTube video we show for family, and they flagged that thing so quick.
Here, we're gonna do closing statements here. Sleepy Steve, would you do us the honors?
Well, I will say it was a very pleasant conversation. We got into a bunch of different things, and I think there's going to be some people maybe in the chat who were expecting more blood sports. They were expecting, to go hard with the 1-2 punches, and that's not what I was just trying to see where the conversation goes. I wasn't looking for any, crazy gotchas. It was just a polite, fun, interesting conversation, and I thank you for being a part of it. And while you didn't move my position on the God question, I will say there is one being that I do believe exists that is always watching, and that is Mickey Mouse. The mouse is always watching, so don't you dare, don't upload nothing. No.
I don't know if there's enough reasons to believe Mickey Mouse is watching, man. Like I don't know if I have enough evidence for that.
Try to upload a rip of Cinderella and see how fast you're believing.
That's a good conclusion. I'm just gonna leave it there. I think that's profound.
I just did not expect Mickey Mouse. It came out of nowhere. All right.
I mean, I think he won the debate with that point.
John 1-1, Sleepy Steve 1-1. Yeah, thanks both for coming on, man.
You're welcome, guys.
If you guys want, I'm gonna jump over to this other debate. If you guys want, you can hang out in the backstage and still chit chat or whatever. Would you guys want to come on and do this again?
Yeah. We'll set it up.
Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna end the live here. Just because you guys liked it so much before I end the live.